In today's episode, we follow the fighting on southern Okinawa to its bitter conclusion, as US forces face their toughest challenge against a series of imposing ridges and an enemy determined to fight to the last.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here again, another week, another podcast, and we're still fighting our way through the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, one of the, or perhaps the last major battle of the war, one of these defining moments of World War II history. I think it's the third episode, if I'm not mistaken. In the first one, we set the scene as we always do. We looked at the historical and strategic contexts. And the second episode, we looked at some of the fighting. We looked at the operational planning. We looked at the fighting in the north. We looked a little bit at the naval battle, I would say, and also the kamikaze attacks, the sinking of the largest battleship that the world had ever seen. So there was a lot going on in that episode. So let's continue with that and have a look at the other part of that particular island, the southern part, where the fighting is even heavier than in the northern part. As I always ask, where do we start? Where do we take it from? What do you think?
Well, you've done a good job with a lightning summary of where we are in the campaign. We are in late-ish April, mid-April, let's say, if we're looking at the southern aspect. Remember, folks, just as a refresher, Okinawa is a long-ish island, 105 kilometers long, north to south, and very thin. So at this stage, the US has control of the northern, let's say, 2/3 of the island, the important airfields that are there. But this southern part of the island is the more heavily defended part. It's where the Japanese want to continue to grind down the Americans and extract as high a cost as possible. This is the rocky part of the island. There's lots of limestone ridges with often sort of difficult access points, narrow access points to some of those ridges. It's also where the ruined town, the capital of Okinawa, which has over 400,000, or which had before this over 400,000 civilians living there. This town is called Naha. There's a port there. There's a Japanese naval base there. So this is kind of where it's at for why Okinawa is an important place for the US to attack, in addition, of course, to its convenient strategic geographic location, not very far from the Japanese home islands. So I think what we want to try to do in this episode is take some time and go through some of this absolutely grinding slog. The reason why the Okinawa campaign lasts 82 days, even for a relatively small island, is because of what happens here in the south. It's also, by the way, I'll get this in now because I wanted to mention it in the last episode and forgot. As far as I know, it's the longest continuous carrier operation that the US has ever, or that anybody has ever engaged in. So let me know in the comments if I got that wrong, if there's another, but I have that in the back of my mind that I read that somewhere. In any case, you've got a whole lot of carriers supporting this operation for a very, very long time. So, Matthias, I'll turn it over to you. Why don't you get us going here? What are the Americans trying to do to move south? Why does it go so slowly? How are the Japanese able to make it so difficult for them?
When you look at the forces that the Americans use, so you practically have three divisions that in the early phase fight their way through Okinawa. So it's the Marine Division up in the north, and you've got two divisions that are fighting down in the south. That's the 96th and the 7th Infantry Division. So even in the original planning, the Americans understood that the fighting in the south was probably going to be harder because they sent more troops there. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, they know that the Japanese are there en masse. They know that they've got good defensive positions. And this is normally always linked to the terrain. We talked about the terrain, the general terrain of the island a number of times, so I don't really have to repeat this. But what you do find here in the south, in particular, is a number of ridges that the Japanese use as the backbone, you might say, of their defensive line. And they use the soldiers that they've got there from the 32nd Army and also the civilian population, which is mainly in that area there, to build the defensive positions, these defensive lines and works before the Americans arrive. So you've got the majority of the Japanese forces there. You've got some well-prepared defensive positions, and the terrain with the ridges lends itself to the successful conduct of a defensive battle, which again makes it quite difficult for Americans to push through and fight their way through. Also, when you've got ridges, depending on where you position yourself on the rearward slope, for example, you can negate quite a bit of the indirect and also direct fire support that the Americans had, for example, through their ships and also through their artillery. And that, of course, is a good thing for the Japanese because they're very much on the back foot when it comes to fire support. This is very much an American fire support battle that is being fought here. So in the greater scheme of things, and when you look at the Battle of Okinawa and the chance of the Japanese winning this battle, they're always slim. But you do know, as the Japanese commander, if you can make a stand somewhere and fight the Americans to a halt, it's going to be down here in the south.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the Americans run into these ridges pretty early on. I mean, we talked about how the landings are not very strongly opposed. And then there's this movement to the north. But the movement to the south, even though they have less ground to cover, let's say, to get to the southern tip of the island, goes much more slowly. And they start hitting these fortified ridges. I mentioned some of the names very briefly, I think, in passing in the last episode. Among the early ridges that give the Americans some problems, you have Kakuza, you have Nishibaru, and you have Tombstone. Eventually, of course, there will be the famous Hacksaw Ridge, which is not necessarily known as Hacksaw Ridge as much at the time. It's the Maeda Ridge or Maeda Escarpment. And you can imagine how this kind of campaign saps not only your fighting forces, because of course the Americans are suffering casualties, not close to what the Japanese are suffering, but it saps their morale in a way, and it exhausts them. So I'm getting a bit ahead now, but we'll catch up on how the operation plays out. But you have to imagine there's one ridge after another, and if you're an American Marine or infantryman or tanker, because they have tanks on Okinawa as well, we'll mention those a little bit, and you have all this firepower helping you. You see the aircraft coming in, dropping napalm and bombs, rockets. You hear the ships firing these big shells, whether they're 12-inch or 15-inch or what have you, and they're crashing into these ridges that you can see above you. This is a great feeling, right? My grandfather told me, fighting in Northwest Europe, he always had a real positive reaction when he saw British or Canadian or American planes, especially bombers, going over his head, because he's like, they are somehow, my job's going to be a bit easier because of them, right? So if you're an American and you keep seeing that every ridge, it gets pounded like this, and you get there and you assault the ridge, and it's an absolute nightmare to try to take it, because the Japanese, as you say, they're on the reverse slope. They're in a bunker. They're in one of these limestone caves that go deep under those ridges. Of course, the firepower affects the Japanese. Of course, it drives some of them mad with shell shock. Of course, it wounds many. Of course, it kills many. Of course, it destroys ammunition. It destroys positions. But it's not enough to really make it a simple thing to take that ridge. It's a very, very difficult process. And this eventually, because this lasts, this phase, let's say, of ridge after ridge, without getting very far, lasts for a long time. It lasts, let's say, at least until the end of May. So you're looking at a sort of 6-week period where progress is very, very painstaking. And the US starts to see, hey, we've really got to start rotating our units who are at the front, because the men are getting exhausted. You can't just go ridge after ridge and close combat to close combat and flamethrowers to flamethrower. Like, it's an awful thing, not because they're running out of men, but because the men reach the end of their psychological and physical strength to continue fighting. They have to be rotated out. And this is a sap on your combat effectiveness if you have exhausted units, if you have units that are not breaking down from loss of morale, but suffering to some extent with their morale because of the difficulty of the fight. The Japanese just won't surrender, even though they're beaten. Psychologically, it's very difficult. And that's, I think, a significant component to many of these island hopping battles, but especially Okinawa because of the scale and the sheer length of the grind.
Absolutely. And you also need to make sure that you clear the entire area, because quite often you had Japanese soldiers that were left behind in their dugouts, in their positions, that had not been seen and neutralized as the American troops were going forward, or by the indirect fire support that they had. Because as impressive as it is and looks, in the end, artillery, even its naval artillery itself, cannot defeat an enemy, cannot seize an area. So you need the infantry to go forward. And quite often you had these Japanese troops popping up in the back of the American lines and start firing and shooting at the GIs. And of course, you can imagine that again has a very bad effect on morale. And of course, the Japanese are also then they're driven back. They're defending themselves. They don't have the initiative. So you might say that makes it relatively, in inverted commas, good and easy for the Americans to advance. But of course, in accordance with good military tradition and thinking, the Japanese also take the offensive. There's a debate in the Japanese chain of command there, because the senior commander, he just wants to fight the defensive battle because he thinks that we're not strong enough to launch the attack. One down, his general, he's a bit more gung-ho and has an offensive spirit, says, no, we need to counterattack. In the end, the Japanese actually do counterattack in the southern sector. It's basically 3 nights, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th of April. And en masse, the 32nd Army attacks the American forces. So again, suddenly the Americans on the back foot. You might think, well, we've got the Japanese, I wouldn't say on the run, but we've got them contained. They're sitting in their dugouts, and suddenly you're hit by them. That again is reasonably bad for American morale, probably. On the other hand, you might say what raises morale is the fact that in the end, this Japanese attack is defeated, mainly, again, through American firepower. And the consequence of that is in the Japanese chain of command, they realize that, you simply can't win an offensive battle against the Americans in a scenario like this. So from now on, it's all about pure defense for the Japanese. They also realize that the Americans are very vulnerable to a few things, for example, night infiltration tactics. So it's one of the things that comes on. They said that the Americans are really, really bad at securing their perimeters and making sure that no one gets in. Probably because they're not expecting this. But in the end, the Japanese are defeated, and their lesson is, the lesson that they learned is that we can't attack. We just have to sit on these ridges and fight in attritional battle against the Americans, which hopefully will then mean that they suffer so many casualties that potentially they give up, or at least, if you start thinking ahead, they would think twice about the invasion of the main islands of Japan. One of these big questions, I mean, you're sitting there as a Japanese in the southern part of the island, you kind of cut off, you're facing at this overwhelming, particularly firepower that the Americans have. And the question is, why do these guys keep fighting? I mean, that's one of these questions. We've looked at this a little bit, talked about things like honor and societies and whatever you want to call it, talked about fear in the previous episode as well. But it's one of these underlying really interesting questions that you find. You also find on the Japanese side, of course, the realization that the Americans are building up an ever stronger force. So I said the Americans have got these 2 divisions that they sent south initially. You then have on the 9th of April another division that lands and goes into line. That's the 27th Infantry Division. So the Americans are getting stronger and stronger on the ground and everywhere else, whereas the Japanese are getting weaker. But they keep going.
Yeah, the Americans, it has to be said, I think if you read a lot of German and Japanese assessments of the Americans from earlier in the war, one of the themes, one of the critiques that they have is, well, they just don't have the stomach for a fight like we do, right? They're gonna retreat. They're not going to accept casualties. This is one of the hopes that the Japanese have when they start the war by attacking the Americans at Pearl Harbor, is that if we seize enough of our Asian empire that we want to have, or our co-prosperity sphere empire, however we want to call it, that the Americans, they're just not going to pay the price. They're soft. And I've read interesting accounts from, Japanese naval officers. I mean, some of them say, hey, we shouldn't do this. But others say, no, I've been on an exchange at some military academy in the US or naval academy in the US. These people are soft. They're not going to pay the price. They're not going to fight hard enough. They will accept what we've taken, or at least part of what we've taken. And man, they are learning the error of their ways and those assumptions. The Japanese are paying for it. Not the people who made those assumptions in the late 1930s, but the people on Okinawa in those positions. They're paying for it because the Americans are able to continue fighting, even though they are suffering from, as we said, a lot of trouble with exhaustion, some issues with morale because of that. They do not stop. And that firepower that the Americans have allows them to make up a little bit, to lessen the impact maybe of some of that exhaustion, because, okay, you can rotate in new units, but they have so much more behind them than the Japanese do, that helps sustain, I think, their combat effectiveness in a way that, it would erode more quickly under these conditions if they didn't have that amount of firepower. So sometimes these different factors kind of interact with each other, and morale can collapse more quickly if you don't have them supporting each other, and it will sustain itself through much more difficult challenges if you do have it. So, Okinawa is one of many cases where the Americans proved this Japanese pre-war assumption, cultural assumption, by some Japanese wrong, that they were indeed able to fight through some of the most horrific combat and take, for American standards, heavy losses, not compared to Japanese losses, but still fairly heavy losses. Our American listeners, if you're interested in World War II, you may have heard this story before. In any case, Okinawa is a place where I personally think one of the most admirable acts of heroism, bravery takes place. There's a famous ridge, Hacksaw Ridge. This is one of the ridges that delays the Americans so badly. It's so difficult to capture, also known as Maeda Ridge. And it's in this area that for 3 or 4 weeks in April and May, there's this one US stretcher bearer he's a stretcher bearer because he's a conscientious objector. So he doesn't want to be a combat soldier. So he ends up as a stretcher bearer. Now, I don't know, how do I want to set this up? But one of the reasons why this, I'm at a loss for words here, because I think this is an important historical example. It's one of the things that interests me about history is, I think oftentimes if we're interested in the history of war and military history, one of the fascinating human aspects is, what is that experience like, and how difficult it is for people to take up arms, expose themselves to danger, or be willing to maybe take life and inflict harm for whatever the cause may be. This is a fascinating thing. There's thousands of books written about how this works, why it works, what impact it has on the waging of war and not, and all of this. And here you have an example that seems to go against a lot of that. Conscientious objector, doesn't want to fight. They came in for a lot of criticism during the 2 world wars in different countries, people who didn't want to fight. And of course, that criticism involves, you're not loyal, you're not a part of the community, you're not willing to take risks, you're not willing to carry the burden that others are willing to carry. Very serious criticism. And here you have a conscientious objector who's going so far above and beyond. A stretcher bearer is a very, very, very dangerous job to have. You're very often exposed. You're not in a position to defend yourself. That's not your job. And of course, lots of them end up getting shot because, the idea of not shooting a stretcher bearer, it's not consistently applied, and that's, I think, being generous if we look at the examples of the two world wars. But we have this American stretcher bearer. His name is Desmond Doss. He ends up being awarded the Medal of Honor, which is, for those of you who might not know, the Americans' highest award for bravery, the equivalent of the more or less of the Victoria Cross for the British Commonwealth. For my fellow Commonwealth people out there, it's estimated that during this month-ish period in April, May, he saves 75 men. And of course, he does that by exposing himself time and time again. I mean, there are Victoria Cross winners who get it for one action, a dramatic action where they expose themselves and take risks and achieve something. And this guy's doing this continuously over the course of several weeks. And there's concrete estimates of how many lives he may have saved, up to 75. I don't know. This blows my mind. Maybe I'm waxing too poetic about it, but I think it's just on the human level, it's such an admirable thing. Oftentimes, when we think about, so-called heroism in war, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword sometimes, where you can say, okay, it's an act of bravery, but at the same time, it's killing people. And, that can create some ethical complications about thinking, do we want to make someone into a hero that we admire, that our society says yes, that we praise, that we give awards and so on for killing? Now, that's certainly a position that creates a lot of debate. I'm not saying that's my own concrete personal position. But to me, there's something to that dilemma, that moral dilemma that comes with heroism in war. And I think one of the reasons why I find Desmond Doss's bravery so clear-cut is because you don't have that. And you don't have that, of course, in other cases of people who do similar things. But his is one of the most dramatic with the numbers involved and the period of time. He was wounded 4 times until finally his wounds were so severe to his arm that he was evacuated from Okinawa and eventually invalided back to the US. Later on, he suffered further problems from his injuries. He never fully recovered. He ended up suffering from an illness that he'd caught earlier in the Pacific Campaign. And he basically became a farmer plus his military pension. So I don't know, maybe that was much ado about nothing, but I really find this story of Desmond Doss compelling. In fact, the Battle Guide YouTube channel did a video about him. So any of you who don't know his story can go and check that out as well. That was my little Desmond Doss tangent and little homage to, I can say without any debate, I think an American war hero in this case. I don't know, Matthias, how do you view his case?
I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking, generally speaking, about decorations as you were talking about this, and a different war and a complete tangent, another tangent here. But isn't it interesting that the most highly decorated British officer in the First World War, Noel Chavas, so he was a medical doctor as well, so he got a VC and bar for basically doing the same thing of getting people out from no man's land and bringing them back to their own line. So there is this interesting link, you might say. So the preservation of human life still counts for something even in war, which is nice to hear, I would say. Yeah. Did you watch the film? There's the film there, isn't there, on Hacksaw Ridge?
There's a film called Hacksaw Ridge, a famous one. I admit I'm not a huge film guy. I have not seen it. So mea culpa to everybody out there. I have not seen Hacksaw Ridge, even though I'm a big fan of Desmond Doss's story.
There we go. But it's in the word, isn't it? Ridge. And we talked about this. There's so many ridges that the Americans have to fight through. And it's probably too much to talk about operation after operation after operation to look at this in this particular area. But you mentioned 75 people, so the casualties are really mounting for the Americans. That happens quite early on. So one good example of the fighting for these ridges is one of these attacks that comes in. It comes in on the 19th of April, and it's one of the major ones because the Americans are using all the 3 divisions that they have at that particular stage in the southern sector. So later on, of course, they bring in different forces. At that stage, they've got 3 divisions: the 27th Division, the 96th Division, and the 7th Division, which is deployed to the very east of the island. And they attack this particular ridge. And it's interesting because there's the highest concentration of guns, artillery pieces to the entire Pacific War. So it's 324 supporting the infantry attack. You have air power, you've got naval power. All this is bringing a lot of ordnance onto the Japanese force. And there's also a tank attack, which is trying to outflank the Japanese positions. However, this attack does not go particularly well because, as we now say a number of times, the Japanese are very well prepared. They're dug in on the rearward slopes, and they're still meeting the Americans with a lot of firepower as they get across. And the casualties are very, very heavy. I mean, you look at the numbers that the Americans are using. Again, we talk about, for example, planes, 650 planes they use as tactical support for the troops, and still they can't break through. So it's heavy. The Americans lose somewhere in the region of 720 casualties as they're trying to push their way through. So it is bloody. It is difficult. And also, when you look at the way the Americans are using the forces, you're basically looking. You might perhaps even say it's some of the First World War scenario. So the front line that each of these divisions is holding as they attack, and the width of their attack is somewhere in the region of, roughly speaking, 2 to 2.5 kilometers. So you're really into First World War trench warfare system. That tells you a lot about the type of fighting, the ferocity of the fighting, also about the terrain, because you need to fight your way through. You need to clear these areas. You need to control them because you don't know where they've got Japanese forces popping up in your rear. So it's really, really a nasty business in many, many shapes and forms.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about how difficult it is for the Americans. Of course, I wouldn't want to say that it's easier for the Japanese, because I think it's even harder for the Japanese. Being on the receiving end of that firepower, even when it's not as effective as the weight of it might lead one to assume, or it's not as effective as the Americans planned, hoped, wanted. I mean, the Japanese are in an absolutely irredeemable position. They can't rotate anybody out when they're exhausted. I mean, it's just a grind until you die, essentially. And that is, of course, a horrific psychological experience for all of the Japanese soldiers involved, regardless of what cause they're fighting for. Their individual psychological experience during the battle is obviously unimaginable for us sitting here today. Very, very difficult thing. Nonetheless, they, as you mentioned, are still able to launch a couple of counterattacks, although they quickly kind of revert back to the defensive attrition focused, because that's pretty much all they can do. They do apparently try a very limited amphibious landing on May 4th, which, how do you... I don't know. The Japanese they keep amazing me in this battle for the things they're willing to try. You've got sort of airborne landings at fuel dumps. You've got one-way trips for the world's biggest battleship. And now you're trying an amphibious landing against the greatest amphibious landing power that the world has ever seen. In any case, they try this on May 4th in order probably to avoid attacking overland, because that hasn't worked. They saw that a few weeks before. They even they risk some of their artillery pieces that they have for this. They move some out into more exposed positions in order to better bring down supporting fire for this small amphibious landing. But as probably comes as no surprise to all of you folks out there, it doesn't work particularly well. And they lose quite a few of those guns, precious few guns that they have, by risking them out in the open. And that early May assault is really the absolute last gasp of any sort of Japanese initiative, let's say. And after that, it's just an unending grind until June 22nd, when it ends. I just wanted to jump in quickly here with another project that we've been working on at Battle Guide, and it has to do with Okinawa as well. We've written a book together, and that means Matthias plus me plus Dan and Spencer from our sister podcast on the First World War, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. The book is called Inferno, and it's about 12 battles that shaped the 20th century from the two world wars. And guess what? Okinawa is one of those battles that we think shaped the 20th century, and I wrote the Okinawa chapter. So if you're interested in a deeper dive into Okinawa and why it was important in the grand scheme of history, then by all means, check out Inferno. You can do that at battleguide.co.uk/inferno.
Just the sheer ferocity, tenacity, particularly also on the Japanese, how we talked about a number of times, you know that you're basically fighting, first of all, for a lost cause. It's a lost tactical operational situation, and they keep going. And of course, it all gets even worse, you might say. It's probably around May time when the weather changes as well, and you get these monsoon rains coming in. And a number of the most famous pictures from this particular battle show, in particular, American GIs with the 100-yard stare in this really bad weather. And a lot of people have compared that again to the First World War. I talked about the First World War and this attack as they go in. And a lot of people said this looks a little bit like, some people say that like the Somme. It's probably different because the vegetation is different, but you get the idea. It's the mud, which makes it far more difficult to resupply troops on both sides, makes it even more difficult to get the wounded out. And of course, the moment you know that the medical system can't really support you and can't get you out quickly enough, that has an effect on morale, again, on both sides. So you can see it's having all sorts of effects as well. We should never underestimate the importance of terrain and also the importance of weather on any military operation. And so, yes, you got this very, you might say, slow creeping forward of the American troops, ridge after ridge after ridge. And you seize one ridge, you know there's another one, and you know there's another one, and the Japanese just keep fighting. So just psychologically, I think that's quite difficult. And of course, we keep concentrating on the Americans, but you said, and I've said a number of times now as well, think about the Japanese situation as well. It's really an interesting one. It's a very interesting psychological study, I would say, that you could run here in this particular battle.
Yeah, no question. I mean, some of these, we're talking about defensive lines and ridges up until late May. And the fighting, as hard as it is to believe, it becomes, it doesn't reduce in difficulty in a way. Now there are individual strong points that are being struggled over at close quarters, places like Sugarloaf, Horseshoe Hill, Conical Hill, and all of this is drenched in rain now, as you mentioned. This makes it, the rain is terrible for everyone, but the US depends on vehicles. The roads are not in great shape on the island, so this kind of harms their mobility, their logistics a little bit. And of course, you have this recurring problem that we've mentioned several times now, that the US has this firepower, but its impact is sort of eroded by the terrain and now a bit by the weather as well. And what they have to do to compensate for that, the Americans, of course, their firepower helps them, but it's not doing everything that they want it to do. So they end up having to do a lot more close quarters fighting than they would have wanted with methods that they wouldn't have wanted. So things like satchel charges, right? Which is where you pack a bunch of grenades or maybe mines or whatever into one satchel or other container of some kind for more explosive power. And then you chuck it into the enemy position. In order to do that, you have to be very, very, very close to the enemy position, which nobody wants to be. Same thing goes for flamethrowers. Even if they're from tanks, okay, flamethrower from a tank is a little bit safer for the attacking force than a flamethrower operated by a person, or a person not in a tank, let's say. But still, it exposes the tank, which is not moving while it's using its flamethrower, usually anyway, to all sorts of dangers. And so this is, these are the examples, these are the kinds of reasons why American units burn out and need to be replaced fairly regularly because of the nature of the fighting. Not only does it take a lot of time, but it's extremely difficult and stressful. That being said, the Americans do manage to take most of the southern peninsula, and they manage to take the ruins of the capital city or town, Naha, by the end of May. So that's not the end of the battle, of course, but that's, I think, a significant marker of their progress, because by the time June begins, the Japanese only have something like 30,000 soldiers left in those pockets in the south. And if we recall, they started with well over 100,000, including the Okinawa militia and the teenaged units, Blood and Iron Brigades, and what have you. So the Japanese are quite weakened by the time we get to the beginning of June, but that doesn't mean, of course, there are no U.S. losses. In fact, maybe the most famous individual loss of an American serviceman occurs in June. You mentioned him, Matthias, in an earlier episode, maybe earlier in this episode, but there's this U.S. general who's killed. You want to tell the story of General Buckner?
So this is General Buckner, and as you said, well, we heard of him in, I think, this or one of the previous episodes. So he's interesting character. So he is the son of a Confederate brigadier general, I think he was. And then I think his father becomes politician in Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken. And so he is the 3-star general here on the island, and he goes forward on the 18th of June. So we're now in June to see what the fighting is all about. Again, there are different accounts as to what happened. So some people, of course, say, well, it was just bad luck, typical soldiers' bad luck, wrong place at the wrong time. Other people say he was actually targeted by the Japanese because. So that side of the account goes in a typical American fashion. He arrives at a particular spot to see what's happening on the battlefield, driving in a staff car that has his 3-star insignia on it, wearing the 3-star general helmet. To be perfectly honest, I've never understood why Americans thought it was a great idea to put your rank on the forehead when you're wearing a helmet. I think that's not very clever. So the story goes that he's actually told to change his helmet, which he does, but it's too late because he's been spotted. Whether that is really true or not, we don't know, because we need to talk to the Japanese about this. But it's irrelevant, really, because what happens is there's a Japanese artillery shell that explodes close to him. And simply because of the terrain, so it's this rocky terrain that you find, there's a lot of rock and shrapnel that flies around, and that hits him, and he's taken back to be taken care of. But actually, the wound is so bad that he dies of this particular wound. So he is the highest ranking American officer to be killed in action during World War II, and remains so until I think there's a 3-star or isn't a 4-star who gets killed in 9/11, if I'm not mistaken.
2001, on September 11th,
there's
I think.
one. So up to that stage, he is the most senior ranking American officer to get killed. So that's it's not an achievement. What is it? It's an interesting story.
Yeah, it's a tragic story because, he's being brave. He's being a brave soldier. He's up within 250 meters of the front lines, not sitting back, not a chateau general or what have you. And he ends up getting killed in the last major battle of the war. And another interesting little detail, I guess, about his tragic story is that there was a photographer there who took a picture of him. I don't know if it was seconds or minutes before that Japanese shell came in and killed him. So it's kind of interesting. It's a bit of a powerful human moment. You can find the picture. I think it's probably in his Wikipedia article, Buckner's Wikipedia article, where he's standing there. There's some grass. You can see some rocky outcrop a little bit behind him. He's standing there. There's a couple of others around him. And you know that person has, just seconds or moments to live. It's a bit of a strange feeling. Historical photographs often have that kind of effect. They almost like stop time, and we can imagine that we are somehow closer to that lost moment than we really are. But I think it's an interesting experiment to do that, to look at that photo and kind of, we know what happens, and to think about that moment kind of being preserved, and us being able to sort of connect to it in our way through space and time. Anyway, not to get too esoteric or anything like that. That's June 18th, right up to the bitter end on June 22nd. There's still different fighting, different combat that's going on, isolated Japanese positions. Matthias, what do we need to know about that final phase of combat before we come to the last hurrah of the Japanese commanders?
Well, even before we get to that period where Buckner's killed, so mid-June, of course, there's lots of other things happening. And perhaps one important aspect that we need to mention, and we don't need to go into the tactical detail, but I think it's probably one of the key things, is you mentioned the seizing and the occupation of the capital. It's also, of course, the occupation, the seizing of Shuri Castle, because that's part of the defensive line. And that's had some sort of symbolic value in addition to military value to both sides. And this is also the incident where then this Confederate flag is hoisted, which Buckner then orders to be taken down 3 days later. So it goes up on the 29th of May. And it's when this line falls, so that where the Shuri Castle is, everybody can see that the fighting is getting into its final stage, because that's pretty much the last big defensive line. The big defensive area is now breached, is broken, is occupied by the Americans. And as a consequence of that, the Japanese now order a general withdrawal to the remaining parts of the island. Of course, that perimeter is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the back therein is getting smaller. It's getting more pressed and pushed. But they're still able to move about 30,000 men further to the south. You talked about this. They start with, roughly speaking, 100,000. So they've suffered a lot of casualties. But when you just think about the tactical situation, so this withdrawal is actually done tactically in quite a good way. You then have the last proper defensive line that's on the Kiyan Peninsula. And there you have, again, very heavy fighting. You have now a number of suicide attacks, what people have called the biggest slaughter of this particular battle, because the Japanese casualties are now really beginning to mount. So you're out of your proper prepared defensive positions. You're now getting hit by American firepower, and so that really gets really nasty. We already mentioned this amphibious assault that comes in as well, which of course doesn't really work. And you might say the last Japanese resistance really collapses and ends on 21st of June, and after that, there's still pockets that are holding out, but everyone can now see that at that particular stage, the fighting is over. Of course, the Japanese have pushed to such a degree. Comes with all sorts of sub-stories that I think we can explore a bit more, because it is now 1945, because it's Japan, there are a number of suicides that we should probably talk about, and some other anecdotes is completely the wrong word, but stories that fall out of this bigger tactical picture that I've just, with a broad brush, have given here. As I said, if we talked about every single foxhole, we'd be here forever. So which are these little kind of sub-stories that we need to explore?
Well, I think there's one small one that I find interesting, probably because there's a written description or record of a part of it that I thought was neat. In a tragic way, of course, we're dealing with the death of people here. And then I think I'd like us to talk a bit about the civilian side of things. So one of these last pockets on the 21st of June is the one with the Japanese command in it, right? So General Ushijima is there. One of the other officers at the headquarters is a man by the name of Cho. And Ushijima's idea was he's going to order one of these grand, the usual, I guess we can say by this point in the war, Japanese suicidal attack. And he's going to commit ritual suicide while watching it unfold. So he has a sense for the theatrical, let's say. And in the end, it doesn't quite work out that way. As far as I know, he's not watching from a hilltop as his men run off to their deaths. Instead, he and Cho get drunk, according to some accounts, and then they kill themselves. And before they do that, Cho writes a poem. And I feel like, we've talked a few times now in this mini series about how hard it is for us sometimes now, today, being Western Europeans / North Americans, to understand, well, what is going on in the heads of the Japanese at this time? Why are they making certain decisions? Why do they become kamikazes? Why do they do banzai, gyokusai, suicide charges? Well, here is one of them writing, at least somehow, some of his thoughts right before doing this. So Cho wrote a poem. I want to give all due credit to this. This is from a real-time history video on YouTube about Okinawa. That's where we first used this quote. And this is a part of his poem. It says, "The devil foe tightly grips our southwest land. His aircraft fill the sky, his ships control the seas. Bravely we fought for 90 days inside a dream. We have used up our withered lives, but our souls race to heaven." So, I mean, on the one hand, you have the first sort of couple of lines. Here's a military man who recognizes the facts, right? The enemy has his grip on our island. He's defeated us. He's superior to us on the seas and in the air. So this is all what we would think, well, that's rational. Yeah, it's in a poem, but it's rational. And then he says, but our souls are racing to heaven because we have fought hard and killed ourselves and all of that stuff. And this is, of course, where it departs from military rationale to these more spiritual ideas that the Japanese had, that killing yourself if you can't win the battle is the way to do it, right? And that will reward you in heaven and amongst the people who remember you on earth. So I thought that was a little interesting insight, a rare poem, at least to my knowledge, a rare poem from a Japanese officer about to commit ritual seppuku or harakiri or what have you.
And there's even more that comes out from this particular person, and of course others as well. So his superior officer, even though I think we talked about him quite a bit, you could see that he's a reasonably rational man. He's some people say he was the best Japanese general of the war. He's very kind of anti-war when it comes to America because he knows Japan can't win. So he's got a clear analytical mind, that person. Even he feels the need to follow in the footsteps of these whatever is the right word, the mythological heroes or whatever, and that kills himself. And also he sends a message back to the imperial headquarters in mid-July. So he says, well, we're now here making the final stand. Everything is basically over. And then he said in this final stance, and then I apologize to the emperor for my failings with my own death. So that's, and again, difficult to understand, but this is expected. And then he sends his last order out to the troops still fighting with him, and that's on the 18th of June. This one reads, "My beloved soldiers, you have fought courageously for nearly 3 months. You have discharged your duty. Your bravery and loyalty brighten the future. The battlefield is now in such chaos that all communications have ceased. It is impossible for me to command you. Every man in these fortifications will follow his superior officer's order." And all that so far, again, sounds very, very reasonable. You could say, yet all that makes perfect sense. And now you would expect something like, well, and now it's time to surrender. This is Japan 1945, so the sentence continues, "and fight to the end for the sake of the motherland. This is my final order, farewell." That's it. And then General Cho, you mentioned earlier, he then actually adds a postscript to this, which reads, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner. You will live for eternity." Ushijima's chief of staff, it's Colonel Yahara, he wants to commit suicide as well. And he asks for permission. He asks a superior officer to commit suicide. And this is refused. And Ushijima says, no. If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. And now the interesting sentence I find comes, "Bear the temporary shame, but endure it." So it's all about shame. It's glory and shame. And that is really interesting. So he's not allowed to kill himself. He then writes a book, which becomes very well known, particularly obviously also in Japan. And that's why he's told to live. And that's seen as shameful. That is, different, very different approach. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. In fact, that's where the extract from this Cho poem comes from, is from Yahara. So from a historian's point of view, I guess I'm glad that he got that order to not commit suicide, because it gives us a different insight, a better understanding of what went on there. So an awfully self-centered position to take, but still. Right. these Japanese officers, of course, are not the only ones. They don't only think that the military has to maintain its honor and die to the bitter end or what have you, but this is something they also impose on a large part of the civilian population. And this is a big part of the story, and I wouldn't want us to finish off our mini series without talking a bit about the civilians on Okinawa, because they have such a horrific experience and go through such suffering. The Japanese sometimes who came from the home islands would look upon them as, not as worthy sometimes. They'd been conquered by Japan in the 19th century. And what they do, we mentioned earlier in the series about how much they pumped up the propaganda saying, the Americans are going to kill you. They're going to do all sorts of terrible things to you. But the Japanese were not treating them particularly well either, because, as you mentioned, they pressed gang some into labor forces to build defensive works. They forced some of the women to be nurses, for example, or they also forced some of the women, and I'll be careful with my wording here for the various platforms that we're on. The general historical term is comfort women, and anybody out there who's not familiar with the term, you can Google it, but I suppose you can probably imagine what it entails, and it's not consensual. So you have already the Japanese inflicting harm on the civilian population before the battle even takes place. And then you have, when the battle begins, you not only have some of them recruited to fight, whether it's the teenagers or this sort of home guard militia, but you have other times where they kind of use them, maybe not exactly as human shields, but the Japanese would force civilians to go out and expose themselves in front of the Americans to collect drinking water or food or whatever and bring it back to the Japanese positions. And of course, this gets lots of civilians killed because, in general, the Americans, and I suppose maybe it's debatable to some extent, but it's also understandable, in this kind of war, you kind of shoot first and ask questions later. And if you see someone who's not yours approaching your positions or whatever, the chances of them not being shot at by you are very, very, very small. So this is another Japanese action that, results in suffering and death on the part of the local population. But of course, the biggest one is probably the mass suicides that happen. This is a result of the propaganda that the Japanese have spread on the island, but also it's an organized Japanese policy. Their military enables, assists, and oversees lots of group suicides. They give villagers hand grenades. They give them instructions to commit suicide when the Americans arrive. All sorts of terrible things flow from this, as you can imagine. Parents following these instructions on their children, groups of people jumping off of cliffs. There's all sorts of stuff. And the numbers are not clear, but it's not small. It's not small. There's one incident alone on one of the smaller islands, I think was 700 people. I think there's records of at least 30 group incidents. And then, of course, you have all sorts of others in the chaos. So to me, this is one of the biggest, most tragic parts of the Battle of Okinawa. It goes beyond, the military operations that we talked about, even what, the military culture and that sort of thing. I mean, this is, these are civilians being forced or driven to the ultimate point by this Japanese military machine, essentially.
And that is, as you say, is reflected in the casualty figures, isn't it? And these are debated. But there's one way of kind of getting a feel, an idea for the casualties. So there is a big monument in Okinawa, and it's called the Cornerstone of Peace. And it's built to commemorate the battle, obviously, and it's on Mabuni Hill, which was the site of the Japanese headquarters. And inscribed there you have the names of, as far as we know, people there know, of everybody who was killed or died during the battle. And the numbers are mind-blowing, really, because when you look at it, so last time I checked, I've written them down here, otherwise I would forget, you had around about 77,000 people from other areas of Japan, so not Okinawa. Then you had about just under 150,000 from Okinawa itself. And that, of course, links in very nicely with what you just said. So not all of these, of course, are civilians. You might get some people who are, of course, conscripts. You might have people who are moved into some sort of militia, which would technically turn them into military personnel. But it also includes a large proportion of the civilian population of the island. So again, the number is it's stark. And when you then look at the losses from the Allied side, so when I checked, you had 14,000 from the US. We talked about casualties a little bit earlier. About 40% of these casualties were actually naval casualties. So that's from the kamikaze and other attacks that you have. So that's a high proportion. It also puts a light on, we talked about the heavy fighting. We talked about how the Americans fight. I think this is reflected in the figures here. So if you've got 14,000, let's say, for argument's sake, 8,000 of these are casualties that are sustained during the land battle. Compare that to the Japanese casualties. You can see there's a very different type of fighting. As we've now said a number of times, a much cleverer way of fighting on the American side. And then you've got smaller contingents. For example, you've got 82 names from the UK, 365 from the Republic of Korea, which of course in those days didn't exist. 82 from North Korea, which didn't exist, and 34 from Taiwan. I think that gives you an idea and a feel for the fighting itself, but also everything, for example, as you just said, about the very awful fate of the civilians that you find there.
Yeah, because that figure of 140, 150,000 Okinawans, of course, the vast majority of them are civilians. And that figure is something like a third of the total population on the island. That's huge. That is an absolute community tragedy that I think is absolutely as important to remember and talk about on a podcast like this one, for example, as the purely military side and the military human cost as well. As far as the impact of Okinawa, it comes towards the end of the war. We now know that the bombs are going to be dropped. And of course, there's a debate there as well. But there is what's not debated is that there is no invasion of Japan. Whether the atomic bombs were the decisive factor or not, we'll probably save for another podcast. But there is no invasion. So in a way, okay, Okinawa is the last battle. But when it's happening, it's not clear it's going to be the last battle. And it's one of the reasons why it takes on the importance that it does. And it's also one of the reasons why we can assess, did the sides achieve their goals, independent of whether an invasion of Japan happened later or not. From the Japanese point of view, of course, we've talked about, how their way of fighting in some ways doesn't make that much sense, costs a lot. On the other hand, if their objective is just to take up American resources, to cause losses to the Americans, to exhaust a portion of the available American military forces in the region close to the Japanese home islands, to delay a potential invasion of Japan, well, they did do those things. They fought for 82 days, they inflicted damage, they exhausted lots of American units, they damaged maybe 200 ships. So if you look at the limits of what was possible for Japan, in that context, they achieved something in terms of harming the enemy. On the American side, it's clear they wanted to more cheaply achieve the capture of the island, but they captured it. And now they have it, and they look at it in a way as a part of the planning process. So how that battle goes is going to influence what they think of that potential invasion of Japan. So they're trying to calculate, what could be the cost of invading Japan? And there are a whole bunch of different calculations and different estimates at the time and later. And the estimates of the time have been discussed and all this sort of thing. There's some estimates up to 1 million casualties. There are others much, much more conservative about what it would have cost the Americans to invade. But one of the things that they use to try to estimate that at the time is the Okinawa casualty rates. How many Japanese were there? How hard was it to defeat them? And how many people did we, the Americans, lose trying to do that? And then multiply that by what we think they have in Japan, what we think the fighting will be like in Japan. And so this has led some observers to the conclusion that the way the Okinawa Operation Iceberg, by the way, I don't think we've mentioned that, the way that played out may have factored in to the American decision to drop the atomic bomb, which lends, a lot more historical importance to Okinawa, even though the invasion didn't happen. So that's my little take on the historical importance.
Absolutely right. And there's not only historical importance, but there's also the importance of Okinawa after the battle all the way up to today, which is interesting as well, because the island remains after the war under US civil administration all the way up to 1972. And only then it's handed back officially to the Japanese. But even today you have, I'm not entirely sure, I think something like 28 or 30 military installations on the island. And again, when you look at statistics and numbers, they always vary slightly, but the sources tell us that about 25% of the island, even today, are basically US military installations. And about half of the American forces stationed in Japan are stationed on Okinawa. So maybe some of our listeners were posted there, have been posted there, are posted there. So if so, let us know. Put a note in the comment what life is like on Okinawa today. That would be interesting to know. But that, again, you can see the importance of the island even today, of course, completely changed geostrategic position. Japan, of course, completely different. I mean, it's interesting. The Japanese military, for example, is probably the most Americanized military that you find in the world outside of the US, which is interesting when you think about everything that we talked about and the fighting for Okinawa and all the other bloody battles that you find. But that's just how history unfolds.
Indeed. And that's how our Okinawa series of episodes has unfolded here on the podcast. We hope that you come away with something new, whether it's some facts, whether it's a way of thinking about things, whether it's one of our many tangents that we've been off on over the past 3 episodes. I want to remind all of you out there listening and watching that one of the reasons why we chose to do these episodes on Okinawa is because our supporters wanted us to do this topic and to do Pacific topics in general, which we will, of course, revisit in the future as well. If you also want to be able to contribute suggestions for what we cover here on the podcast, you can do that by supporting the podcast. You can go to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can also get access to some exclusive content there that's not available publicly in our war room. And you can have a free trial of that by entering the code Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you there, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. And if you want to be able to make suggestions that reach us as well, you can become a supporter of the podcast. The Codcast, that was my Canadian coming out, former cod fishing superpower.